When you guys are ready to go, feel free to kick it off.
Great, thanks, Max. We're very excited for our training session today. We want to note that the training will be recorded. Today we have some incredible guests and speakers. And so our main guest speaker is Fadhel Kaboub, who is a modern monetary theory expert. And he is an associate professor of economics at Denison University and president of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. He has held a number of research affiliations with the Levy Economics Institute and the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. He is an expert on modern monetary theory, the Green New Deal, and the job guarantee. His work focuses on public policies to enhance monetary and economic sovereignty in the global South, build resilience, and promote equitable, sustainable prosperity. So with that, we will let Fadhel do the presentation on modern monetary theory, and then he will introduce some of his guests he brought with him today, who will then be available for a question and answer section. Thanks, Fadhel.
Thank you, Barbie, and thank you everybody for joining us today. It's a pleasure to be here. I wish this was in person, and so we can all gather and mingle and do what we used to do pre-pandemic. But I also wanted to welcome briefly a couple of my colleagues from the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity, Paul Herman, who's a research fellow with the Institute and founder and CEO of HIP Investor. HIP stands for Human Impact and Profits, HIP Investor, which is the company and also the book HIP Investor. And my colleague Scott Fulweiler, who's a professor of economics at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, also a research scholar at the Institute. I'm not sure if Amir is with us here, but Amir Kalegi is also part of the research team, especially on the Green Jobs Report, which I'll mention briefly during the presentation. And I stole a couple of slides from Paul's presentation, so I'll refer to them towards the end. So what I want to do today is present to you the basic concepts that we learn from modern monetary theory, or MMT. You probably have heard plenty about it in the news and kind of public policy debates over the last couple of years for sure. So the reality, the challenges, the myths around what MMT means and so on. So I want to clarify this and then talk about the implications, the policy implications from a macro kind of national public policy perspective, but also from an investment perspective for fund managers, for endowment managers, for anybody who's thinking about how to manage their portfolio for retirement and so on. So linking the MMT approach, especially the MMT analysis of inflation risks, and linking it to real challenges that we're facing, which is climate risks, which, you know, a decade ago, 2 decades ago, most people thought of these as climate challenges and, you know, tree hugging and things like that. Now we're talking about real financial risks that are induced by climate risks. I want to connect the dots in this presentation and show some MMT insights that actually allow us to face these challenges head on and hopefully win these challenges. So with that, hoping this will work. So modern monetary theory, MMT. The label MMT was made popular by some bloggers after 2008, 2009 financial crisis. The label wasn't invented by the economists who actually worked in this area. A better name is probably modern monetary systems or modern money analysis, because MMT, for the most part, is really highlighting some basic observations about how the current monetary system, the banking system, the financial system operates, and then deriving from those observations the fact that there's plenty of additional policy options available to us that mainstream economics doesn't allow us to see. So you've probably seen coverage of this in the New York Times, and Bloomberg, all over the place. I'm just highlighting a few of the key figures in the financial industry in particular. James Montier, who's a major financial analyst and investor, has come out in the last couple of years and saying the MMT approach gets it. The mainstream approach to analyzing the economy is misleading and has been misleading for a long time. I'll come back to these points. I'm happy to share these resources with you, by the way. So James Montier from GMO, Ed Harrison from Credit Write-Downs, very popular piece that went viral, kind of introducing people to MMT analysis and how it can be used for market analysis, for portfolio analysis. Mario Draghi, who's not my personal friend, he's the former head of the ECB, the last conference, press conference he held, completely unprompted. Nobody asked him about MMT. Says probably we should examine new ideas like MMT because we tried everything to figure out how we target inflation, to figure out how we get the European countries out of the crisis. And he's a mainstream economist. I mean, the consensus now is that the mainstream approach to analyzing inflation, analyzing the impact of fiscal policy has failed us. This is a recent podcast on Bloomberg yesterday or a couple of days ago, how MMT won the fiscal policy debate. Highly recommended, with Stephanie Kelton, who's one of the leading MMT scholars, a former professor of mine and colleague. So what is MMT? MMT focuses on the concept of monetary sovereignty. So the idea of monetary sovereignty, a country like the US, we're talking about the federal government, not state and local municipalities. A country with a high degree of monetary sovereignty is a country that can issue its own currency, check, the US does that, collects taxes in the same national currency, check, we do that, and it's a country that only issues debt denominated in the same national currency. In other words, we don't have any external debt denominated in euros or pounds or Japanese yen or anything like that. Now, obviously, this is not the case for developing countries. That's why it's not, one of the main MMT. I'm sorry?
I can look at the rest of it.
Can you, Barbie, were you saying something?
No, I was not. But if everybody can make sure that their phones are muted, that'd be great.
Thank you. So as I'll highlight in a minute, the MMT analysis wouldn't, suggest that a country like Venezuela, which has massive external debt, or a country like Zimbabwe with a massive external debt, do the things that I'll be describing today. And it's also a country that operates under a flexible exchange rate system. In other words, in the US, we don't fix the value of the dollar to gold or silver or any foreign currency. So high degrees of monetary sovereignty allows you additional fiscal spending capacity without facing the risk of inflation, without facing the risk of currency devaluation, and so on. So I'll describe what gets us to that high degree of monetary sovereignty that allows the country like the US to spend beyond the normal limits that most mainstream economists tell us we should do. So MMT distinguishes between currency issuers, like the federal government, versus currency users like you and I. You and I have to work hard, earn an income first. Then we can spend it. We can borrow up to a certain limit from a friend or from a bank or credit card company. Same thing for your local state and municipalities. The state needs to tax in order to spend. It can borrow up to a certain limit, but it can't spend money into existence. It can't have unlimited borrowing capacity. The federal government operates under a different constraint because it can issue its own money into existence. Now, MMT never says that the federal government should print unlimited quantities of money. As you'll see, we'll see what the limits are. But the limits are not tax revenues and are not borrowing capacity, like for you and I, like for states and municipalities, like for businesses. So in other words, don't try this at home. What I'm describing today is for the federal government, not for you and I. All right. So based on that basic definition of monetary sovereignty, we can identify a spectrum of monetary sovereignty, where on one end, you have countries with very high degrees of monetary sovereignty, like the US, like Japan, like Canada, like Australia, the UK, and so on. And the other extreme end, you have countries that have no monetary sovereignty whatsoever. A country like Ecuador that gave up its national currency, or many of the small Pacific Island nations that use foreign currencies like the US dollar or Australian dollars and so on. So those countries have no monetary sovereignty. They have to operate like you and I, like users of a foreign currency. They have to earn it in order to spend it. They have to borrow it if they want to spend more. But then they have to pay their debt in the same way you and I pay debts to a bank or a credit card company. Most other countries are kind of in between, most developing countries. So what determines which position a country is on this spectrum is the level of external debt that they have. And I'm happy to go into a discussion about why developing countries get into external debt and all that. But today I'm going to focus on the US, on this end of the spectrum, countries with very high degrees of monetary sovereignty, no external debt, no fixed exchange rate or fixing their currency to gold or anything like that. So the mainstream approach tells us the limit to spending capacity for the federal government is taxes and borrowing capacity. MMT says there's this additional spending capacity, this yellow space, that's not unlimited, it's constrained by the risk of inflation. And the risk of inflation, according to MMT, is set by two key variables. One is the lack of productive capacity. In other words, if we ran out of raw materials, technology, skilled people, and we decide to spend more, we'll cause inflation because we literally run out of productive capacity. But if we have plenty of additional productive capacity, we can spend more without necessarily causing inflation to kick in. And I'll keep coming back to this point throughout the presentation. The second, well, the good news about productive capacity is that it's producible. We can train more doctors, we can build more hospitals, we can create more productive capacity within limits, obviously, within the environmental limits, ecological limits. The second source of inflation risk is what I call abusive market power and price setting behavior. In other words, if we have powerful corporations that can raise prices simply because they can, or because they have too much market power, too much market concentration of market power, then that risk of inflation, there is no way of eliminating it by spending less or spending more. You eliminate it by taxing and regulating that market power out of existence, by democratizing the market, by implementing or enforcing antitrust laws. That's how you democratize the market, you make it more competitive. And if you do that, you take that bright yellow space of additional fiscal spending capacity and you actually expand it because you're pushing the risk of inflation further and further out. And that's really one of the most important insights from MMT, that we do have tools to expand our productive capacity, to push the risk of inflation and to manage that risk of inflation. The standard theory says if we have deficits, if we have national debt, inflation will go up, interest rates will go up, and we'll go bankrupt. What's been happening the last 10 years, 10 plus years, has proven this to be wrong and has demonstrated that the mainstream approach to analyzing inflation has failed. And now we're left with central bankers around the world, in the US, the ECB, the Bank of Japan, wondering, how do we hit the inflation target? And MMT offers some meaningful answers here. So this is the paradigm shift that we're trying to look at. So what do mainstream economists say about inflation? This is a former Fed governor, 2 weeks after he retired from the Fed. He says the Fed has no reliable theory of inflation. In other words, we have no idea what causes inflation. And he's not the only one. The Bank of Japan has been missing its inflation target for decades, for 3 decades, trying to push inflation a little bit higher to get out of their deflation cycle. The ECB, same thing. Here's the ECB. Inflation forecast versus actual inflation. Month after month, year after year, completely missing their inflation forecast, their inflation target. And ECB is not the only one. This is not a problem with the ECB or of the Fed. This is a problem of economic theory having the wrong diagnosis of what actually causes inflation. There's this implicit assumption that too much government spending will automatically cause inflation. And you hear these people saying, oh, look at Venezuela, too much government spending, hyperinflation. Look at Zimbabwe, too much government spending, hyperinflation. Well, if you go back to the spectrum of monetary sovereignty that I described earlier, I'm not talking about Venezuela and I'm talking about the US, countries with high degrees of monetary sovereignty. Japan has the highest debt to GDP ratio in the world, almost 260% at this point, I think. And they have deflation. They have negative interest rates. Mainstream economic theory can't explain that. MMT can. So what about inflation in the US, to be more specific? We have 4 major areas that actually drive inflation: healthcare, education, housing, energy, and transportation. This is why economists like myself have been calling for something like Medicare for all. It's not because this is like the favorite shopping list of the progressive left or whatever, because specifically what Medicare for all does, what college training for all does, what home guarantees and rent control does, what decarbonizing the economy does, is that you tackle the market power of these key industries and at the same time, you build additional productive capacity. This is the key to managing the risk of inflation. So my worst nightmare is to have massive government spending that doesn't tackle these issues, productive capacity and market power in these areas. Then we're guaranteeing that the abusive price setting behavior will inflate and exclude people from education, from housing, from access to these services. So this is not a political statement. This is a technical statement about what actually causes inflation and how we manage inflation risks. So the MMT analysis draws these particular kind of highlights, whereas mainstream economics completely misses the point and focuses on the broader idea of deficits and national debt and all of that. So what MMT implies as a result is that we should decouple the spending from the taxing at the national level. And this doesn't make any sense in the world of mainstream economics, because you're always taught to tax in order to spend, like you do at the state level or at the city level. The federal government doesn't have to link the two economically. So what do? We spend on national priorities like health, education, infrastructure, whatever it is that we as a democratic society decide are the priorities. But then we tax pollution, we tax speculation, we tax extreme wealth, or we tax abusive market power, not because we need the revenue to spend, but because we need to decarbonize, because we want to reduce the incentive to speculate, reduce excessive wealth inequality, reduce too much concentration of market power in the system. Those are important reasons to tax, right? So tax to protect democracy. If we have too much concentration of wealth and as a result political influence, that's anti-democratic, right? Those are good reasons to tax, but they're not necessary to fund particular programs. So those are the goals that I would draw from an MMT analysis. So examples of how do we pay for expensive programs like World War II or like the CARES Act. Who did we tax before we entered World War II? Who did we borrow from? Right? Can you imagine if before World War II we said, well, let's figure out where are we going to get the money from? Well, right before World War II, it was the Great Depression, the most miserable time in US history. There's no money to be taxed, no money to be borrowed to start a massive effort like World War II. How did we pay for it? 535 people voted and approved the spending, massive spending to build for the war effort. The challenge at the time was not finding the money or finding the votes in Congress. It was not debatable. It was about finding the actual productive capacity to dramatically increase the production of military equipment. That's why we had to shut down the city of Detroit, shut it down in the sense of stopping completely the production of cars and trucks and so on, and shifting to producing airplanes and tanks and military equipment across the country. We brought the country to full employment, beyond full employment, because we needed more production. So MMT focuses on the real productive capacity, not on this idea that where we're going to find the money to pay for this. The challenge during World War II was not to tax somebody or find somebody to borrow from. It was, how do we manage the risk of inflation from this massive spending? We pay these workers decent wages. It's a free country. They can go out and buy houses, buy cars, buy whatever they want. The problem, there were no new houses, no new cars during World War II, because we shifted production to military. So the sales of treasury bonds during World War II was not because we needed to borrow money from the public. It was to convince the public to abstain from consuming during the war, because we literally didn't have stuff for them to consume. It would have caused inflation. So it was buy these war bonds, these freedom bonds, which means postpone your consumption until after the war, when we can build cars, when we build houses and so on. That's how we manage the risk of inflation. And that's how we do it all the time. We can do it again. We can do it on a massive scale. How did we pay for the war, the CARES Act? Where did the money come from? Did President Trump say who we're going to tax or who we're going to borrow from? If anything, last year, if you remember, right around April 15th, President Trump and Secretary of Treasury came out and said, we're postponing the tax day to July 15th. We don't even need your tax revenues. It was getting Congress to set a national priority. We need economic relief for the pandemic. We need to spend on the priorities. There is no need to tax any particular individual or groups of individuals to pay for the CARES Act or for the $1.9 trillion and so on. So that's the point here is that the federal government does it all the time. This is not like unique examples. This is how we finance federal spending. That's why we have a national debt. That's why we constantly spend more than what we bring in. That's why the federal government almost always runs a deficit, and it's not going to bankrupt the country unless we run out of productive capacity. Then we exceed the capacity of the economy to handle the additional spending. Then we cause inflation, and that's where you have economic breakdown, when you exceed the productive capacity. So MMT always says, spend always with an eye towards the risk of inflation. So don't wait for inflation to materialize. Always plan for the sources of inflation, potential sources of inflation, and tackle them either by boosting productive capacity in those strategic areas or taxing and regulating abusive market power that will cause an inflation spiral. So the next item that I want to cover today to connect the dots is climate-induced financial risks. This is probably relevant to all of you working at the Treasurer's office, anybody who's managing an endowment, a pension fund, and so on. 10 years ago, these used to be more academic topics that not a lot of people cared about. This is reality now. These are risks that are on people's balance sheets as we speak today. We're talking about climate refugees. We're talking about a carbon bubble, that is a financial market bubble induced by overpriced assets, fossil fuel assets that will lose value over the next couple of decades. Stranded assets is a term that 10 years ago, most people thought that this is some kind of new derivative or something. My kids, your kids, their generation, they'll play, they'll do backflips with stranded asset. They'll understand exactly what a stranded asset means, because this is going to be the reality of financial markets in the next couple of decades. A climate Minsky moment. A lot of people are familiar with Minsky's financial instability type of thing, excessive consumer debt that blows up during a crisis. Well, this will lead to a climate Minsky moment, these overpriced debts that will materialize with climate change. A double Minsky moment in the sense that not only will we face instability because of climate risks, but in our attempt to finance green infrastructure, green technology, and massive climate resilience infrastructure, if we finance a lot of it with private sector debt, we build instability within the corporate sector, and that will, in and of itself, cause a secondary Minsky crisis of private sector corporate debt. So we need to be very careful about how do we finance this climate resilient infrastructure for the future. I don't have to do a whole lecture on climate change. This is water stress globally. This is already conflicts happening, displacing people, climate refugees. The blue bubbles, I believe, are military conflicts, and the orange bubbles, I believe, are, no, it's the other way around. It's actually worse. The blue are natural disasters, pushing people, displacing people, and then the orange ones are military conflicts, and they're linked. They're not separate. And the crisis in Syria started with a massive drought that destabilized the economy, pushed millions of people to move from rural areas to urban areas. I'm happy to discuss that during the Q&A. This is the World Bank report, not your tree huggers institution. They're talking about millions of people on the move and millions more in the next couple of decades. By 2050, which is in our lifetime, the day after tomorrow, we're talking about millions of people in Africa and Latin America and other parts of the world being displaced because of climate change. Where are they going to go? They're going to move to the global north, adding stress on jobs, on schools, on hospitals, on you name it, the whole thing. I mean, a few million, few thousand Syrian refugees moved, and Europe was panicking. Just wait for this. I grew up in the Middle East, and there's already studies confirming that by 2050, the region will be uninhabitable in the summer months. We're talking about 300 million people potentially moving from the region. All of these things are happening. JP Morgan last year had an internal report that was eventually leaked to the press, And they're talking about the IPCC report, the UN report that gave us 12 years at the time to act on a massive scale. They said, those guys are optimistic. It's actually worse than that. So they're talking about the real climate risks. And it's the investment banks who started actually applying pressure in the US, in the European Union, on governments to take this seriously, and especially on central banks, on the ECB and the Fed, which is why this year, both the ECB finally joined the NGFS, which is the network for greening the financial system, and the Fed finally, 3 months ago, also joined NGFS, the network for greening the financial system, because they want to figure out a way to leverage the firepower of the Fed, the firepower of the ECB, and their regulatory role to transform at least and mitigate the financial risks that these banks, that pension funds, that insurance companies have on their books right now. And those risks will kick in as we speak. That's the climate, that's the carbon bubble. Those are the stranded assets of the future. This is a report just focusing on stranded assets in real estate only. Only coastal cities in the US, the Union for Concerned Scientists, they estimated by 2045, and they picked 2045 on purpose, because if I get a mortgage today in Florida, 2045 is on my mortgage. That's a risk that I have today. If I get insurance on that house, the insurance company has that risk on their books. And they estimated 2045, $1 trillion worth of real estate stranded assets in US coastal cities alone. And the risk is global, obviously. The unburnable carbon in terms of how much is already priced in and fossil fuel assets on oil companies and so on, that we are not going to be allowed to burn. Those are stranded assets, also trillions of dollars in this. There's increasingly more studies. All of these studies, by the way, are coming out of the private sector, bankers, not academics, not environmentalists. They're seeing these risks and they're panicking, and they applied pressure on the Fed, on the ECB to take this seriously. So how do we pay for these things? We're told the government is broke. We have no money. Zimbabwe, Venezuela would, call their bluff. MMT highlights that the federal government has that additional spending capacity to address these things. We're not Venezuela. We're not the Weimar Republic and so on. Is there hope? Yes. Wall Street is panicking. Insurance companies are panicking. That's good, because they're going to move investments in the right direction and apply pressure in the right direction. The ECB and the Fed, as I said, joined NGFS. Renewables are gaining ground just on price and efficiency standards. They're going to displace fossil fuels sooner or later. The return to fiscal policies is a reality. As I said, MMT won. Now we at least have governments around the world recognizing that more deficits, more government spending within the parameters that I outlined today are not inflationary. They're not going to bankrupt the country. So, and these are the slides I stole from Paul Herman, just to highlight an examples at the micro level. I'm a macro person, and Paul does the micro stuff. We're the yin and the yang here. So, ETF, fossil fuel free, rated A. Let's look at the performance last 5 years. You can't beat that in markets today. This is not like if you invest in, green technology and green ETFs that you're going to lose. You're giving up something. If anything, you're losing if you don't invest in the infrastructure of the future and the technology of the future and the clean energy in the future. So there is a way to leverage portfolios to actually have an impact. This is HIP fossil fuel free data from Paul. Again, I stole this from Paul. Resilient on the way down, more successful on the way up, right, throughout the cycle. So there is a way to construct portfolios that can actually outperform standard market benchmarks and actually have the positive impact of moving away from the fossil fuel risks that are built into the entire investment composition of most portfolios these days. And this is really what NGFS is designed to do, is to help central banks via regulations, via incentive, kind of create the right framework for people to shift away from riskier investments, riskier in the climate sense and in the carbon bubble sense, towards more resilient investments and to support the infrastructure that we need for the future. Again, another micro example, this is the great work that Paul and his team have done with Becker College. Within a matter of, what, a year and a half, trustees decided, you know what, we're going to switch to more kind of hip investment strategy, and we're going to do this gradually, and we're going to dedicate a certain portion of the endowment to this and see if it will outperform the market. And it did. You don't have to do what Becker College did. You can do a hypothetical. Let's look at the last 5 years and construct a hypothetical portfolio and see if it outperforms your actual portfolio. And if it does, then it will tell you how much money you gave up the last 5 years and kind of give you an idea of where you should shift your strategy. So all of these things are things that academics, that people like Paul are trying to nudge the Fed, nudge the ECB, nudge financial institutions and endowments to do the right thing, because this will be impactful, transformative. So you have the macro view that tells you what are the risks of inflation. If you're managing a portfolio, you want to know what the risk of inflation is. And this is why mixing the two, kind of the green investment strategy, moving away from risky assets that are currently in the system and managing portfolios by knowing what are the things that will actually drive the Fed to raise interest rates in the future. What are the things that will drive inflation? Because if we know what drives inflation, we know when the Fed will raise interest rates or why the Fed will raise interest rates. So that's how you connect these three pieces. And with that, I'd like to just draw some basic conclusions. We have less than 10 years to act on a massive scale, both on the climate front and on the financial risks front in portfolios. The climate crisis calls for urgent and bold policy actions. The current policies on climate, on jobs, are too weak, too slow, too expensive, and literally dangerous from a climate perspective, from a financial perspective. We're talking about trillions of dollars worth of market value to be lost. Weak climate policies are unaffordable. Again, from a climate perspective, from a financial markets perspective, we can't afford the losses. And most of those stranded assets are in financial markets in the US and the European Union and Japan. This is happening. So I believe that economic prosperity and climate action, they're not trade-offs here. Via bolder green investments are possible, desirable, and affordable. And with that, I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Fadhel. That was excellent. For anyone who has questions, please feel free.
This is Max. That was an exceptional presentation. Quick question, following up on your piece on certain industries and companies that are going to be in a very precarious position. I'm thinking utilities and oil and gas companies in the next few years, as their assets may be highly devalued if they have, if they are overinvested in fossil fuels and outdated technologies. I'm curious, do you foresee, or you and your colleagues foresee, a major correction happening in the next maybe 3 to 5 years, where if those companies are not transitioning, their assets and their value is going to take a major hit?
The short answer is yes. The longer answer, I'll ask Paul to do this. I wish I had your slides from yesterday, Paul, because he had the energy industry, the water infrastructure, all of those lined up in terms of HIP ratings. So Paul, why don't you jump in and tell them a little bit about the HIP method and specifically the energy industry?
Sure. Hi, I'm Paul Herman from HIP Investor. We're 15 years old into impact investing and ESG. And as Fadhel introduced, we have 2 books published by Wiley, the HIP Investor book and the new Global Handbook of Impact Investing. We're a registered investment advisor, so we manage money for clients, and we are also a ratings agency on impact and ESG. To your question, Max, about what's coming, when the next correction hits, just as the last correction hit last year, oil was strained. Historically, the economy has been based on a fossil fuel economy, and we're transitioning it to something that is more sustainable and less extractive. And not only less extractive for planet, but less extractive for people and for trust. So the 10 to 15 years ago, some of the highest market cap companies were Exxon and Chevron and ConocoPhillips and Total, for example. Those are not the highest market cap companies anymore. Exxon, for many of the past several years, has not been able to pay its dividend. It's had to borrow capital to issue debt to pay its dividend, which should be being funded from cash flow. So the next market corrections will continue to highlight stranded assets, as Fadhel introduced. They'll continue to reward companies that are more resilient. So Fadhel and Scott Fulweiler and Amir Khalegi, who were all part of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity, but we've been creating a monthly green jobs report. And so looking at the Bureau of Labor Statistics granular data to say what jobs are being created in which industries, and are those industries more sustainable or more extractive. And what we found over the past year, essentially during COVID, is more sustainable companies and industries are more resilient and hold jobs, less sustainable, less resilient, lose jobs. The greener ones have higher pay, the less green ones have lower pay. And the really interesting thing about COVID, this was timely when we did this together, is even in industries like hospitality or restaurants or travel, the more hip, the more sustainable companies, the more hip companies like to say, had more resilience, and the least, even in high contact industries, the less had less resilience, more job losses, more pay, more loss in pay. So at both a micro level and a macro level, these are important. And from a portfolio perspective, you want to position your portfolio for what the future will be, not what the past has been.
Agreed. Thank you.
Paul, do you want me to share that slide with different industries, utilities, water? I have it in front of me.
Yeah, either that or the job gains and losses and the pay gains and losses from the green report, the green jobs report.
Yeah, I put the green jobs report op-ed in the chat for everybody to read.
Great. Yeah, and that's the 6-month view, and the conclusions have continued. 1 year in is sustainability is not only more resilient for people, planet, and trust, and less extractive of human capital, environmental capital, and trust capital, but it's a smart synergy. There's limited trade-offs.
Yep. An additional kind of MMT insight from a portfolio kind of financial instability perspective that a lot of people miss in financial markets is the following. Because over the last 3 or 4 decades, we've had governments around the world, especially governments like the US, European Union, and so on, essentially trying to be more fiscally conservative, restricting their borrowing potential, which means restricting the amount of bonds they issue, AAA rated risk-free assets in the market, relative to the size of the private sector, the massive expansion of the private financial sector over time. And if you're managing a portfolio and you want to dedicate a portion of your portfolio, either by choice or by regulatory requirements, to risk-free assets, to AAA rated assets, whether it's corporate or government, the risk-free asset is US Treasuries, right? Is government issued bonds. And if you're starving the system globally of those financial assets and the system is expanding, then you're building in relative instability in the portfolio because you're moving to riskier and riskier asset classes relative to the anchor of the financial system. So the MMT implications that says governments should increase their spending capacity will actually feed financial markets a stronger anchor in portfolios in the form of risk-free AAA rated federal government assets. So that's an additional point that should be considered at the macro level, obviously.
I have a question. So Professor Fadhel. Always great to chat with you. I've been following the debate between Stephanie Kelton and Paul Krugman as they, go over the printed and radio airwaves to debate each other on the merits of MMT. But there's also been a lot of conversation around the role of economic policy versus fiscal policy when it comes to issues such as income inequality and wealth inequality. I think some of the Fed presidents around the U.S. have commented about, the role of economic policy in helping to provide either investment in many of these areas, and not just based on cities, but even just in rural parts of the country as well. So the question is, where does MMT play a role in terms of addressing the issues of wealth and income inequalities, whether it's one that's based by race and ethnicity and gender, or one that is based on geographies, especially in many parts of the heartland here in the U.S., which is obviously Illinois is inclusive of that.
Right. Absolutely. Very good question. And here I'll say a few words, but I'd like to present also my colleague, Scott Fullwiler, who's one of the leading MMT economists and has engaged back and forth with Paul Krugman as well over the last few years. So MMT essentially shines this bright light and says, hey, there's additional spending capacity. There's no reason for artificial austerity and saying we can't afford investing in after-school programs. We can't afford investing in broadband infrastructure and healthcare infrastructure, all of the things that tons of academic studies and reports have told us. If you want to address inequality, structural inequality, especially when it comes to socioeconomic isolation, which is historical in the US and isolated in these pockets within this part of the country, the Appalachia. I'm in Ohio here. We need substantial investments, right, in infrastructure so that you have this big push where you invest in broadband, you invest in job creation and educational opportunities and good paying jobs. All of this, the mainstream of the economics profession tells us, is too expensive. If the private sector is not going to do it, the government can only do this much. MMT says the government can do this much without causing inflation, right? Without waiting for the private sector to kick in. There's a role for the private sector for sure, but the private sector is not going to go to rural Appalachia and invest in billions of dollars worth of broadband in poor communities who can't afford to pay the bills, right? But the federal government can do that and provide the initial investment, which will then de-risk the investment opportunities for the private sector, because you have people with jobs, with infrastructure, with transportation, with good health. Now there are opportunities for private business to thrive. This is what we're talking about. So MMT says the additional spending that we're dedicating to rebuilding the infrastructure of the country, addressing structural issues in education, infrastructure, and health, and so on, all of these things are affordable, non-inflationary, and common sense. Here's why. The statement that I've been repeating over and over again over the last year or so is the following. The cost of doing nothing is too expensive. The cost of doing the right thing, which is all of these investments, that's actually the cheap option. That's the affordable option. And Scott and some of my colleagues here, we're involved in a study that we're doing now for an organization called Reimagine Appalachia for Ohio, Pennsylvania, Kentucky, and West Virginia. We're actually quantifying the cost of doing nothing. The opioid crisis alone, the White House told us, the Trump White House a couple of years ago issued a report quantifying the opioid crisis in the last 4 years, pre-2018, I think, $2.5 trillion. That's money we're wasting, we're spending with the additional pain to individuals, communities, families, and society. $2.5 trillion just the opioid. One of my colleagues just took one county in West Virginia, estimating the cost of the drug crisis in that one county, $1.6 billion per year. Like, that's affordable? Instead, the investments that we're talking about are cheaper, more impactful, produce the jobs that we want, produce the quality of life that we want. It's a no-brainer. The cost of doing the right thing is actually the fiscally conservative option, is investing in the right strategies. The fiscally wasteful strategy is what we're doing right now, which is the economic pain, the exclusion, the no jobs, and so on. So Scott, if you want to jump in and talk about the debate with Krugman.
Oh, sure. Yeah, which one? So, hi everybody. I'm Scott Fullweiler. I teach the PhD macroeconomics courses here at UMKC. Co-author several times with Stephanie Kelton and Fadhel, and now really enjoying working with Paul and also Amir and Fadhel on these on the green jobs and these sorts of development issues. But to the question, I mean, we could spend the whole hour on this, but I think in general terms, the big picture is from what Fadhel's saying, the big takeaway is we don't need the money of the rich to do big things. And that's been part of the problem, is we've always been told we have to be able to tax the rich to do things. That's been the way the political center left. That's essentially why we haven't done important things, is because you can't get those sorts of things passed. Now, the problem from our perspective is if you have to tax the rich to get things done, then you need them to remain rich, right? You need them to be,
or even richer.
Richer, right? I mean, not to criticize specifically, say, Elizabeth Warren, because a lot of people have come up with this one, but you might have heard there was this wealth tax that was being proposed 1 or 2 years ago, 2% of your wealth above $10 million, whatever. Yeah, I mean, if you think, yeah, it'll bring in a good deal of revenue, but if you think about it, all they have to do is earn more than 2%, right? And the wealth continues to increase, right? And that was kind of the point, is don't worry, we're not going to take too much, right? So from our perspective, we're divorcing the need to have specific amount of revenue match particular spending. And so it frees you to think differently, to think, okay, instead of just saying we're going to increase taxes on people making over a certain amount of money and it'll bring them this much revenue and we can spend that much, let's think about this differently. Let's say, what would it look like to have a more equal economy, right? Bottom up, top down, what does that look like and how do we get there? We're not now limited to raising the highest tax bracket a few percentage points. It opens up the conversation, because the conversation has been very, very narrow for decades about what to do about inequality. And so Fadhel mentioned a number of bottom up sorts of things that we've been working on. There's a number of top down things. Certainly you could do taxes if you want, but the point of those would be to reduce inequality, and you'd have to start to think carefully about what it means to reduce inequality, right? In the first place. Sorry, my phone was ringing, and all I can hear in my headphones when my phone rings is that. So, but let's see. But yeah, I've been going on for a while, but let me just then close by saying, when you're not consistent with what Fadhel's been saying, when you're not matching the spending with the revenue, now we're worried about the inflationary impact. And when the proposals about, say, taxing the rich that we've seen, pull very, very little inflationary potential out of the economy relative to what's being put in. And so that's another problem. If you spend $1 trillion and you tax the rich $1 trillion, in terms of the effect on biophysical resources available, that was not an equal trade-off. And so we want to change the entire conversation, and we need to think rigorously now about what it means to reduce inequality, because I don't think we've done that. I don't think the left has done that overall. And I think the way that MMT goes at it enables you or requires that conversation for the first time.
Very helpful insights and perspectives. Thank you.
I realize I think we're technically out of time, and this question is almost assuredly out of scope by its very definition, but your points about sort of addressing inequality using modern monetary theory are really resonating with me. Laura Williams, I'm the Director of Policy for the office. And especially when I think about efforts at the state level to address inequality and sort of states' inherent inability to truly leverage MMT. So I'm wondering if you could maybe briefly talk about that dichotomy that we face as state government people?
Very good question. So yes, as I said earlier, jokingly, don't try this at home or at the municipal level because you can't, right? You don't have this spending capacity. But things that, you know, municipalities and states and people in the professional setting that many of you are in can help us do is send the right message to the currency issuer, to the individuals who have the power of the purse, and say, hey, we know what to do at the local level. These are the programs that need to be implemented. These are the kind of bulletproof, successful, impactful programs that need to be introduced at the school level, the summer programs, you name it, you know, all the infrastructure. We know how to implement them. We know how to assess them. We know how to hire and fire for them. Your responsibility is to use your power of the purse and fund these programs, fully funded by the federal government, because the local authority can't do it. So this is kind of one short answer. Another short answer, which I'm hoping will come from the Fed, not necessarily from Congress. I'm always optimistic about the possibilities with Congress, but I'm also realistic. So the Fed, because they just joined NGFS, and I think because they're taking this seriously, and because Wall Street is applying pressure on the Fed to do something about the climate risks that are actually on the books right now. One of the things that the Fed can do today without any change in policy or anything is look at Paul Herman's HIP investor ratings of municipal bonds, for example, and say, hey, municipalities who are building resilient infrastructure, climate resilient infrastructure, we're going to lean in with the firepower of the Fed in the municipal bond market and lower the yields and encourage municipalities to actually do the right thing, right? With municipal funding, that sends the signal to investors, portfolio managers that, hey, the Fed is leaning on the green bond market and it's going to sustain it for the next 30 years. It sets expectations towards these are the investments of the future. This is, plus it's, you know, tax-free at the local state level. There's the additional incentive. These are things that can happen like today. If the Fed wanted to do this, this can happen. But other things are in the hands of the 535 people we elect, the lawmakers, the regulators, who can actually fund on a much more substantial level, who can actually use antitrust laws to make markets more competitive, who can set regulatory standards in terms of what is acceptable for a healthy, sustainable, equitable society. That's why we have a democracy, a government of the people, by the people, for the people. Right?
Let me maybe say a few things. You actually took my first one, which was the Fed using 14.2 to support municipal bond markets, increasing liquidity, allowing those to be collateral for when banks and others borrow from the Fed and so forth. So it could do all sorts of things for the interest rates that state and local governments are paying, as Fadhel noted. I think a big one also, well, I mean, if we had more time, Fadhel could probably talk to you about the work he's doing with complementary currencies and things like that. And we've also have worked with some people on public banking legislation and so forth. But anyway, a fairly good sized one that comes up every time there's a recession is, and it came up last year, as you surely know, is when the economy goes into recession, state and local governments have to balance their budgets and your revenues fall and you have more needs, et cetera. And, you know, we saw last year that Congress was able to sort of hold state and local governments hostage, right? And act as if it was their fault for their declining revenues, when of course it was an economy that had the rug pulled out from underneath it that was the source of the declining revenues. So what we need at the federal level is some sort of framework there's we like to say in MMT some balance of discipline and elasticity. The elasticity being some ability for the federal government to make your budgets whole when the economy turns down. There has to be, so that you're also not reacting against the federal government's attempts to stimulate the economy and the Federal Reserve's attempts to stimulate the economy. But then there would have to be some discipline on that side, which, you know, could be something like showing that if the economy is at full employment, your current budget is balanced, or, you know, various sorts of things, meeting certain sustainability standards, whatever. But that would be another thing that could happen that would enable you to, not have to cut things so much when the economy turns down, and be more of a stabilizing force.
Well,
I'm happy to answer additional questions. I know some of you have to go back to work. This is probably your lunch hour or something. But I'm happy to stay if there are additional questions, but I completely understand if people have to leave, obviously.
I have one quick question still on the topic of inequality, and just from my understanding, especially in the past, say a little more than 10 years, periods of expansionary monetary policy have also been leading to increases in wealth inequality because of the increase in asset values, right? Despite the recession that we're in, you know, housing is booming right now. Housing prices are booming. The stock market is booming. Private markets are doing very well. And the greatest beneficiaries of that are those who actually own those assets. And with MMT, do you think that monetary expansion there could also pose the risk of actually exacerbating wealth inequality specifically?
You can, if you apply it the same way. So one of the things we say about MMT is not something to be introduced. MMT is describing how the system is currently functioning, but it's functioning the way you just described it. MMT is not saying we need to redistribute wealth, you know, tax the rich and give to the poor and do that. MMT is saying we need to pre-distribute wealth in the right way to begin with, right? So you spend to address the sources of inequality so that you don't feed more income inequality, but rather you feed the engine that will actually reduce inequality. So the standard view is tax the rich and give to the poor, redistribute. But that doesn't actually address the roots of the problem. It's just feeding the existing engine, which produces pollution, produces inequality, produces exclusion. MMT is saying change the engine altogether so that it pre-distributes wealth from the beginning. You spend in the right category so that you produce more equitable, cleaner, more prosperous society. So MMT is saying if we know what the areas of investments are that will actually produce less inequality, that's where we need to spend, right? That if we know that we need to fund infrastructure, fund, you know, state and local municipal budgets, I mean, it's common sense. Again, wouldn't we rather spend money on after-school programs and summer camps to inspire kids with music and theater and, you know, science and technology, or not do that because it's too expensive, and then end up building prisons for those same kids and paying for the opioid crisis? Common sense. Wouldn't we rather invest in clean energy infrastructure, clean water, clean air, clean soil, or not do that because we think it's too expensive, and then end up paying for cancer treatment for everybody in the city for the next 30 years, which is many times more expensive, and it doesn't really address the problem. So this is the approach that MMT tries to shift the narrative about the strategies that we know are effective, but we're told are too expensive right now. We can't afford them because we don't have the tax revenues, unless the private sector lends us some money, or unless the rich allows us to tax them a little bit more. MMT says, no, if you know what the right strategy is to address inequality from the roots, which means you invest in prenatal health, early childhood education, right? The cheap investments that we're not doing right now, instead of having to pay for all the secondary health effects and social effects 20, 30 years later, which is what we're doing right now. So MMT says we have that spending capacity. Let's do it to kind of tackle inequality before it materializes and you start to reverse those things.
Can I jump in on that one really quick? Just directly addressing the monetary policy point, because it's a very good one that you made. There's actually a study that just came out about 6 weeks ago at the New York Fed that showed that not just inequality, but also racial inequality worsens when we rely on monetary policy. Because of course, that is the Fed's approach, changing interest rates, changing asset prices to manage the economy. And the people that have all the wealth are going to be the ones that are going to see those effects, because we have, if you manage the economy through monetary policy, you are encouraged to stimulate the economy. You're trying to encourage more borrowing. You're trying to encourage more wealth and spending through capital gains and those sorts of things. Whereas if you are using fiscal policy, you are sending people income and trying to get them to spend more out of income. We're not opposed to using monetary policy. We wouldn't use it via interest rate manipulation. We would do more credit controls and things like that, and try and keep asset price bubbles from happening in the first place, is where we would go with it. And that has, counter-cyclical effect on its own. But then, as Fadhel's been pointing out, we think we should have a lot more counter-cyclical stabilization through fiscal policy. And again, mainstream economists have come around partway to that. So they've done all kinds of movements in our direction. We haven't done any movement in their direction over the last 10 plus years. But I think that distinction between what monetary policy and fiscal policies do is very important.
Thank you. Fadhel, I had a question. You brought up the, and I know we're running late, so people have to jump off. I'm going to take the meetings. But, you mentioned the study in Appalachia and how you basically are quantifying the risks associated with not doing anything, or the societal deficits. How, with something like that, like in the state of Illinois, what are you looking at, and how would we be able to understand and utilize where funds would best go in order to have an impact that would actually increase their bottom line, even though you're spending money, because the ultimate long-term impacts of not spending money, let's say for like on homelessness or something, would actually cost the state that much more versus what if we did something about housing now and investing in housing infrastructure, even within the state.
Yeah, so Reimagine Appalachia is a coalition of 100 some organizations from Ohio, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Kentucky. And we're focused not on all kinds of problems, just 4 categories of investments that we really need in this region. And I think you two also need it and the rest of the country needs, which is number 1, investing in modernizing the grid and turning quite a bit of it to renewable energy. Number 2, broadband infrastructure, especially in rural areas, but also in urban areas. Number 3, reinventing a CCC administration for the 21st century, to invest in green spaces, cleaning up the mess from the last 100 years, and investing in regenerative agriculture. And there's already a CCC bill that's being drafted that will be out. There's actually 3 of them being drafted right now. So I think it will happen. And Joe Biden talked about it a month ago. There's the next category is green manufacturing in the region, right? To build this green infrastructure, create the jobs here, to build the resources for the region. So these are the types of investments. And I think the dollar amount that we're talking about is something like $70–80 billion, which is nothing, right, to transform the region in the 4 states. We're trying to quantify the cost of doing nothing, which is the opioid crisis in the region, the cost of the prison industrial complex in the region, the health costs associated with pollution, with the lack of access to clean water and so on, and the stress, and tons of social science studies showing that every time we have high levels of unemployment and poverty, we have increases in crime, increases in suicide, in anxiety, in stress. All of these things have massive public health costs, right? The cost of not having clean needles for people who already use is additional healthcare spending on all kinds of other diseases that happen for no good reason other than not having, access to clean needles, for example, which cost like a penny as opposed to, the hundreds of thousands of dollars that we spend. So these are the kinds of things we're trying to quantify. We'll probably not include every single social problem that we have in the region. Just if you pick 3 of these buckets and quantify them, is many times more expensive than the cost of the 70 or 80 billion dollars that we're asking for. So in the next few months, you'll see probably a series of little op-eds and kind of talking points with numbers to tell our senators and Congress people that this is the right investment for the country. What we're doing right now is already too expensive financially, too expensive on individuals, on communities. We're paying for it and we're not getting the jobs, we're not getting the health, we're not getting the better quality of life. So for a state like Illinois, it'll be a similar types of investigation, looking at the actual data at the state level in terms of how much are we spending today to deal with the negative effects of poverty, of unemployment, of pollution. Every time somebody goes to a doctor for asthma treatment or something like that, you spend money, right? You pay a bill, GDP goes up. We call that economic growth. It gets celebrated on TV. Say, yay, economic growth. Every time we build a prison, GDP goes up. It's economic growth, but is that actually improving our quality of life? Is that addressing the root causes of social problems that we have? Of course not. It's not dealing with the problem. It's paying for the consequences of the problem. And somehow we celebrate that as growth and prosperity. What we're saying is if we spend the right way in the first place to eliminate the need for more prisons, to eliminate the need for more, preventable diseases and health effects, we have better quality of life, we have better jobs, we have more productive members of the community, and we get the economic benefits too. So it's not just quality of life. So these are the kinds of studies that we're involved in to make it a no-brainer, essentially, for all of us as a country to invest in the right thing.
Great. Thank you so much. I know we've taken a lot of your time and we really appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you.
Enlighten us and teach us more about modern monetary theory. And to all of the guests that you have brought with you has really been a treasure for the Treasurer's Office. It's really been great. And I think we've all learned a lot. And I'm sure if we have any other questions, we'll send them along. And then there's also links for everybody that participated. There are links in the chat section. And feel free if you have any additional questions to reach out and contact any of us. So thanks again. Thank you for your time. We really appreciate it. And we're very grateful.
Thank you. I'm happy to share the slides with anybody, and feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions by email or by phone. We're happy to talk one-on-one or in small groups if people are interested to follow up on this. Thank you again.